back a year ago.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Beer Bound Podcast. Today, we are joined by Professor Tycho van der Hoog. Tycho holds a bachelor's degree in history, a bachelor's degree in political science, a research master's degree in African studies, and a master's degree in history, cum laude, from Leiden University. Tycho is currently a PhD candidate at the African Studies Center in Leiden. In 2019, Tycho wrote the book Breweries, Politics, and Identity, the history behind Namibia's beer. The book aims to explain how a European-style beer has been transformed from an icon of white settlers into a symbol of the independent Namibian nation. So we're super excited to talk to Tycho about this and this particular text. So Tycho, welcome to the Beer Bound Podcast. How are you doing today?
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. It's really a pleasure.
Yeah, it's delighted. I know I really have delved into this book and really enjoyed a large portions of it. I found it quite fascinating. It's an area of study in a particular geographical area in the country that I'm not too familiar with. So it really did teach me a lot, and I'm excited to get a bit more information from you here. So Tycho, I gave some information about you, but could you go a little bit deeper in who you are, why African studies is so interesting to you, this particular topic, why does it interest you? Maybe your focus, your interest in beer, does that sort of coincide with this? Take it away.
Well, definitely. I was studying in Leiden, as you were saying just now, and I was mainly interested in the topic of nationalism. And as you can imagine, there are many different angles to approach that topic. And my studies were mainly focused on Europe and America, actually. So I was, after 1 or 2 years, thinking there are probably more spaces outside of this European American focus. I had a very interesting professor who sort of nudged me towards the African continent as a field of study. And that intrigued me because I had never been to an African country before. Neither were my parents, so I didn't have any exposure really to Africa. But I realized that lots of countries within the African continent became independent very recently. So for the study of nationalism, this is actually a great opportunity. And then I sort of stumbled upon the topic of beer as a lens to view nationalism and political history. And that's basically how I ended up in Namibia for my master's degree at the time. I traveled there, spoke to a lot of people, did a lot of archival research, also in South Africa. And then after a few months, I realized that the story that I was writing down, was quite interesting. At least that was what I was hoping. But now that it's published, I'm getting a lot of responses also from people within Namibia that relate to the history of beer on a personal note as well. So I'm just very excited that it has become available.
Tycho, can I ask you what really interests you about nationalism? What was that about this particular topic that interests you? I know this has been a hot topic for maybe forever. We're kind of tribal by nature, perhaps, and that's a pretty interesting phenomenon, why we as a species latch on to our nations and become overly proud, and how that can lead to some good things, maybe a lot of bad things. What interests you about nationalism?
It's exactly what you're saying. It's a double-edged sword. It's a very powerful force that is shaping the course of history. And I cannot deny that I'm also susceptible to it. I'm Dutch, so whenever I see a bottle of Heineken in a bar, some place far away from home, I recognize a little bit of Holland in that. And we just had a World Cup, for example, and I find myself, wearing orange T-shirts and shouting like a maniac at a TV screen. So yeah, nationalism is something that affects all of us. And it doesn't really matter, I think, in what part of the world. If you look at the past 200 years, nationalism has been a decisive factor, I think, in the course of history. And simply because I was so accustomed to European history and American history and political science, it was so exciting for me to look beyond that horizon and immerse myself in African studies as a discipline. And I would recommend actually anyone who has a similar sort of interest to look at beer as a window into these big movements.
Was there a few reasons why you chose beer? Is that you mentioned Heineken right now? Did you is beer something that interests you in another level, or you sort of found this as a topic that pertains to the country that you were studying, Namibia? What's your connection to beer, Tycho?
It's not a very profound connection. I must be honest. I mean, I love drinking beer. I've never brewed it. I must say. If I'm ever in Toronto, I should do a tour review so I can learn a bit more about the process. But I was studying. I was specializing in African studies throughout my studies, and then I heard about beer in Congo, the DRC, and that seemed to be a really interesting topic of study. And I basically stole that idea and applied it to Namibia. So that's how it came about.
And what brought you to Namibia? Was that sort of coincidental? The program that you chose was there? Did you have an interest in this particular country prior to that? What brought you there in the first place?
Well, I'd never been to Namibia before, but I had a professor who was specializing in Namibian history, so that already helped me, zooming in a little bit on that part of the world. But obviously, there needs to be an interesting research question. There needs to be a reason why Namibia stands out. And when I was reading more about beer in Namibia, I quickly became fascinated. And I'm always surprised when I realized that Namibia became independent in 1990. So that is little over 30 years ago. It is incredibly recent in the grand scheme of things. And if you travel to Namibia today, you will find beer everywhere. It is the cornerstone of Namibian nationalism. In any corner of the country, you can get an ice cold Windhoek lager, and it's a famous beer also that is being exported to countries across the world. It's winning national prizes in Germany for the best beer. There's basically one company in Namibia that is dominating the brewery market and has done so for 100 years already. So you cannot escape beer when you travel to Namibia, but very few people realize, even Namibians themselves, hardly realize that for decades on end, the same beer by the same company was not available to the black population because of colonial legislation. So there is this interesting paradox where a settler's drink during colonial times was transformed into a symbol of a unified and independent Namibian nation. And then I wanted to understand how that's possible.
Okay, so Tycho, so take us back. You do a great job in your text, kind of going through the history of Namibia, a lot of it pertaining to the 20th century. Can you take us back? Tell us a little bit about this country's history, its colonial roots, and where the book sort of starts off in the chronological order.
Well, the colonial roots date back to 1884, and the country that is today Namibia became a German protectorate. It was called German Southwest Africa. And the Germans, they colonized the country. They executed a genocide, the first genocide of the 20th century, in order to establish control. And for the white settlers that had arrived and were trying to make a life in the desert, drinking was their main leisure activity. So if you look at the corporate registries from German Southwest Africa, 1/3 of all businesses involved liquor. And for every 41 settlers, there was one bar. And newspapers at the time, they would write about Windhoek, the capital city, and describe a disease which they called Windhoekeritis, which basically consisted of drinking, gambling, and prostitution. And at the time, everything that the settlers were using or building was imported from Germany. So horses, building materials, weapons, and women, but also beer. But you have to imagine that this beer had to withstand a long sea journey in order to make it from Germany to the coast in southwestern Africa. So this was quite strong, heavy beer. But Namibia is well known for its desert climate. So what you actually want to drink is something a bit lighter, a bit fresh. And this basically resulted in the establishment of the first formal breweries. And every small settler town had at least one brewery, and some had multiple. And those were like very small 1-2 person operations, very local. And for me, in my study, this is where I describe the first formal breweries, in addition, of course, to the home brewing that existed for centuries already.
Yeah, can you take us back and tell us about alcohol in Namibia prior to German colonization? Was this what were the alcoholic beverages that were consumed? Were the indigenous population of Namibia, were they alcohol consumers?
Definitely, there were already different ethnic groups living before German Southwest Africa was established, and for hundreds of years, these groups were brewing their own beer and different sorts of liquor. And you can think of honey beer, for example. I think that was quite a popular drink for a long time. And beer was both important for culture, for different rituals within those ethnic communities, but also for dietary reasons, for nutrition. And I found a couple of these ancient recipes in the archives, because the earliest German missionaries and colonial officials were making their own studies of trying to understand those populations, and they were writing down some of the recipes that they were finding. And what I find interesting about them is the creativity that clearly involves brewing beer across the centuries. So they were using everything that nature had to offer. For example, animal skins and the earth, in order to help the brewing process, and all sorts of different ingredients. I already mentioned honey, but also peas and potatoes and all sorts of different stuff that existed at the time. And I included some of the recipes that I found in my book right at the end. And it is still a lifelong dream for me to try and see if they would work today. So maybe one day I can do that.
Yeah, maybe you could send me those, Tycho. I'd like to look into them. That's really interesting. Okay, so you have 1884, you said, the Germans arrive. That seems to me a little bit recent, because I think, I could be wrong, but I think in similar areas you had Dutch colonization, English colonization in South Africa, you had Portuguese in Angola and Mozambique. So did Namibia have interaction with colonial powers prior to that, or that was sort of the main period?
No, it did have relations to European nations, and it mainly happened through explorers and trade. So those were two important domains that already existed. But it was quite difficult to establish a colonial presence in the area, partly because of the coastline, which was very rugged, very difficult to navigate. Still, part of the coast today is called the Skeleton Coast, so that already says something. And you can take a small aeroplane, fly above it, and you will find the shipwrecks that have stayed there over time. It's quite impressive. But yeah, in 1884, the Germans arrived. They established their own colony, and it was actually a relatively short-lived colonial dominion, because when the First World War broke out in 1914, South Africa invaded German Southwest Africa. If that makes sense, it can be confusing sometimes. But that ended the German presence in the colony, and South Africa took over through a military excursion.
Okay, so we have 1884 is the beginning. Then we have you focus a bit on the Great War, which is World War I. Can you talk a bit more about the Beer War that you spoke about in your book? What was the Beer War?
The Great War impacted the beer industry to a large extent. The market crashed because many Germans left the colony. Ingredients were hard to get by. There was, of course, destruction by the war efforts. So the market, when the war had ended, the market became too small for those many small independent breweries that I mentioned before. And the two largest breweries in particular engaged in what was called at the time a beer krieg, a beer war. And they engaged in heavy criticism with each other in the national newspapers that existed. And if you look at it today, it is actually very childish, because they would take out these adverts in rivaling newspapers and accuse their competitors of brewing beer with seawater, instead of normal water. And this went on for months and months, and I'm sure that they spent a considerable amount of money making sure that these advertisements were published. But in the end, in 1920, a few savvy investors got together and they merged those larger breweries into a single company, which they called Southwest Breweries. And this is the company that still exists today and still dominates the brewing market in Namibia today.
So Southwest Breweries, that initially was an amalgamation of two breweries, or more than that?
It was I think 3 or 4, but the largest two that were involved in the beer war were the most important components of what is now Namibia Breweries, but used to be called Southwest Breweries.
Gotcha. Okay, so the First World War happens 1914 to 1918. Obviously, the entire world changes at that time, and particularly the European powers, Germany being a pretty important one. So what happens? Is there any conflict that's occurring in Namibia at that time? How do they get dragged in to the war effort?
Germany had to let go of all of its colonies. There was quite a difficult decision for the German imperial nation, of course, and they had some colonies also in Eastern Africa, for example, and those were divided amongst the rest of the world by the League of Nations, and the League of Nations is the predecessor of the United Nations. And in 1920, South Africa took over formal control over what used to be called German Southwest Africa, and simply was named Southwest Africa in this new political situation. And in the mandate agreement, so that's basically the legal document that ensured that this former colony became basically a new colony by South Africa. The third article of this mandate agreement included a very important section about alcohol, because it stipulated that the supply of alcohol to the native population, to the indigenous population, was prohibited, which effectively meant that the Black population was not allowed to drink beer. And from that moment on, beer legislation or alcohol legislation, but I often use those terms interchangeably because beer was by far the most popular alcoholic drink available, became one of the prime concerns of the South African states in an effort to control Southwest Africa, what is today Namibia. And that's quite an interesting story because I didn't actually expect alcohol to be such an important part of the colonizing experience, so to say.
Why would they do that, Tycho? Why would they prevent the indigenous peoples of Namibia of consuming alcohol? Is that just a way of instilling control in their colonial efforts?
It's basically about control and using the indigenous population for labor, making sure that they are quote unquote reliable laborers for the colonizing project. There were also some, I would say, racist prejudice about Black people not being able to hold down their liquor. There were some almost like Christian ideas about like raising the population like up to certain standards. I'm saying this very carefully. These are not my words. But I would say that the main driver of these events was a desire for control and subjugating the population where they wanted it to be. And the League of Nations, the predecessor of United Nations, gave Namibia to South Africa with the aim of a certain trajectory, in the sense that in due course this country would become independent. But South Africa basically did something else and decided that Namibia would become a fifth province of South Africa, and they never had the intention of letting this colony go. And in 1948, the apartheid government came to power in South Africa. So that's a white minority government that introduced the idea of apartheid, segregated development for white people, Black people. And those same laws were also imposed on Namibia. And this is relevant for beer simply because it resulted in two distinct beer markets. So there was a formal market for white people, and there was an informal market for non-white people. And the colonial government, and by this I mean the South African government, really did a lot of effort trying to control the population through liquor. So if you look at the statistics, 60% of all criminal cases with regard to the Black population included liquor cases. 60%, so the majority. And 90% of all the fines that were imposed on the Black population resulted from liquor cases. So the colonial state as a whole was preoccupied with alcohol and basically with beer.
You get into the 1920s, alcohol is prohibited with the Black population, but I suspect that the Black population still probably maneuvered around those laws and legislation. I don't know if there's too much research that you could draw upon from that, or did you find anything like that?
They did. Homebrewing was the main way for the indigenous population to still enjoy a beer at the end of the day. And this caused a major problem for the colonial state because, as you can imagine, this sort of thing is incredibly difficult to shut down. So the colonial state decided to employ a carrot and stick method towards this problem. And the stick was very easy. They basically conducted liquor raids. So they would destroy hundreds and hundreds of informal brewing facilities across the country. And the carrot, that's quite interesting. They designed this concept, which was called a beer hole. So the black population also had to live in segregated places. They were not allowed to live in the city center, and they were pushed towards certain townships. And within those townships, beer halls were established, and those were places under firm colonial control, where a specific, specially brewed, very light beer was supplied to the local population. And I was reading like the transcripts from the colonial government in the archives in Namibia, and people would complain that even their morning tea was stronger than the beer that was being supplied to them. But the very gruesome and ironic idea behind these beer halls was essentially that the profits were used to fund the apartheid state. So people were essentially drinking themselves further into apartheid. But at the same time, home brewing and smuggling and all sorts of stuff that happened time after time after time. And finally, in 1969, the government realized that this could no longer go on the way that it was going. And the liquor legislation was repealed in 1969. And this led to a boom in shebeens. And shebeens are very small, informal, often illegal bars. And thousands of them erupted across the country and still exist today. And the majority of Namibians are still enjoying their beer, not in like a bar as you and I would imagine it, but they are drinking in shebeens.
Would you say that, Tycho, into the 1920s, that some German influence and culture still resonated, or that was pretty much obliterated after the loss of or the I guess the takeover of South Africa into what we know as Namibia now? Did the sort of the British influence of South Africa kind of take over in terms of maybe beer styles or beer creation, or did the influence really kind of stagnate for a while?
That's an interesting question. I firmly believe that even though the German colonial project had ended and many Germans left the country after the First World War, and then with the Second World War, Germans became very suspicious. And within what is today Namibia, Germans at the time were interned in special camps, so they weren't allowed to move freely through the country. But the beer industry was already based on a German presence, and that continued throughout time. So the main brewers, like specifically the people that made the beer, often came from German descent. And also the beer styles that were enjoyed by the white settlers were very much German influence. So they would, or like the lighter beer, like a 4% Pilsner, that was the most favorable drink. But they also had a Munich type of lager and different bock beers, which were brewed seasonally because the winters can be surprisingly cold in Namibia. So throughout time, even with all these different political changes, upheaval, Great Depression, everything that happened in the 20th century, those German brewers, remained important.
You just mentioned that the Great Depression, you focus a little bit on that as well. So that's into the 1930s. The global economy kind of tanks. How did this affect beer consumption, the beer market, Namibia in general? What was the Great Depression like?
It was very difficult for the beer market, as you can imagine, because it became difficult to extract goods from the European continent. Also, the domestic market suffered simply because of economic problems. I think that at the time, the local brewers were trying to find different ways of keeping production going, and they were sourcing the materials from all over the world and trying different recipes and so on. But what I find fascinating with regards to Germany is that if we then make a step forward to the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, they suddenly adopted German brewing recipes again for their own production, and they were thinking of ways to distinguish themselves from competitors, because after the crash in the 1930s, the market was sort of recovering, became stronger and stronger, more competitors arose, and then the question, of course, was how can we be different from other brands, and they decided to adopt the Reinheitsgebot, which is the German purity law from 1516. And even today, Namibian beers are brewed according to the Reinheitsgebot. And even today, the basic language within the brewing facilities is German.
That's I was wanted to get to that too. How much has the German language resonated or persisted or sustained itself in Namibia? Is it still a functional language in the country?
It is definitely not a functional language for the majority of the population. So I was even more surprised that when I was, walking through the brewing facilities in Windhoek, that I would hear German all around me. And this not only pertains to the white population that works there, but basically everyone who works there. And the trainees that are being educated, they are sent to Germany for 1 or 2 years to learn the craft, and also to learn the language. Every year, Namibian beers are being sent to a German festival where they win first prizes, and are being scored better or higher than German beers. But in Namibia itself, there is every year an Oktoberfest, for example, where the beer is being celebrated. So there is still a strong continuation of German culture and German appreciation that extends also beyond the white minority of the country.
Mm-hmm. Okay. It's so fascinating. This is very interesting. Okay, so we have the Great Depression, then into the late 1930s, Second World War happens. You talked a little bit about this, Tycho, but okay, so from 1939 to 1945, we have the Second World War. Germany's back on the world stage as being the principal aggressor in this conflict. How did that shape Namibia's existence into the 1940s?
Yeah, that was a very strange period for the German brewers that were working in Namibia, because they became very suspicious. What I found in the archives is that those breweries were also being surveilled by the colonial state, because they were thinking that maybe there would be another German uprising in Southwest Africa, and they would want their colony back, so to say. This eventually did not happen. But they became very suspicious. It became very difficult for them to move around, to source their goods, etc., etc. And there were some accusations also that there were criminal, I would say, activities going on, and that instead of sourcing hops, they would be sourcing weapons. These sorts of stories are found in the archives, but they're very difficult to corroborate. So I'm saying this hesitantly, I should say. But it was a difficult period for the breweries. And I think they even stopped producing beer for a little while, which is of course always bad news for any brewery. But for some reason they persisted, and they survived. And this is something that I also mention in the conclusion of my books. You can throw anything to these brewers. I mean, all these major developments, these major obstacles, but they always found a way of keeping their breweries going and surviving and moving with those developments instead of against it. And I think that is the central reason why we still have this one company today that has been existing for over 100 years and has been surviving all of these transformations.
Okay, so the Second World War occurs, some interesting developments and connections. I guess, yeah, there was no aggression or actual conflict in the southern region of Africa, was there? No fighting persisted, I don't think.
Not in the sense that it had in the First World War.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So then after the Second World War, we get a bit more peaceful and a global perspective. The 1950s and 60s, I think you speak a little bit about a transformation, some changes that occur in Namibia in this particular period. Can you touch on that, Tycho?
Yeah, we should maybe discuss the liberation struggle for a little bit. Um, Obviously, the local population was not happy with the colonial South African state, and from the 1950s onwards, in particular, there was organization in the form of nationalist political movements. And in 1966 was the official start, so to say, of the armed struggle between SWAPO and the South African state. And SWAPO is the Southwest Africa People's Organization, became the most important nationalist movement. Not the only one, but the most important, because they were the ones waging an armed struggle. And this took quite a while before SWAPO became successful, because Namibia only became independent in 1990. So for a long time, SWAPO was pushed into exile, fighting a guerrilla war, trying to organize political support also outside of Namibia. And what is interesting is that the brewery, so there's still one brewery that is still brewing the beer, and is now even allowed to sell also to the Black population. It is keeping itself entirely distant from those political developments, even almost going into the opposite direction, in the sense that they are embracing a white Southwest identity. And those are the years, the 1960s are the years that they really align themselves to this idea of white settlers in the country. So they're completely tone deaf, I would say, of everything that's happening around them. And the best example, perhaps, to illustrate this is the logo of the brewery. And the logo at the time was a picture of a German soldier on horseback, an equestrian rider. And this soldier, this monument, was established already in 1912, at the end of the genocide that I mentioned before, the first genocide of the 20th century. And a monument was placed in Windhoek at the site of a former concentration camp to underline that the Germans were the new masters of this country, of this population. And the brewery looked at this and thought, you know what, this is a great logo for our beer coasters, our bottles, our posters, etc. And they they applied that to all of their marketing. And it really shows you that even though the market had opened up in terms of the color bar was removed, it was still a very tiny operation compared to breweries across the world, and it targeted a very small public.
So how long, Tycho, did this uprising, this conflict exist between the two forces, the independence movement in Namibia against the colonial presence of South Africa? How long did this persist? What was the outcome?
Yeah, in 1990, the Namibia became independent. Shortly before that, the first democratic elections were held under the watchful eye of the United Nations. And this is, of course, an incredibly important moment for Southwest breweries, because they had to find like their position, and I think they weren't really prepared for independence, even though it had been long coming, and everyone knew that the situation, maybe no one knew when independence would come, but there was already a strong belief that it was inevitable in a way. So in 1990, Namibia became independent, and the management of the brewery quickly changed gears. but also not so very quickly. Let me explain this briefly. So they, for example, they brewed a special independence lager that they distributed across the nation. But if you look at the label of the independence lager, it still said Southwest Breweries, referring to Southwest Africa, the former colony. So they weren't super quick to sort of prepare for what was going on. But what was very smart, I would say, of them was that they got together with the new independent political regime, which consisted of SWAPO officials, so that the liberation movement became a political party, became the new regime, and is actually still in power today. So it has won every election since 1990. So SWAPO and the brewery, they got together and they recognized that they needed each other. And what the brewery needed was protection, because Namibia is a very small market. Today, it only has 2.4 million people, so a very small customer base, potentially. So they needed protection from other competitors. And SWAPO recognized that the brewery was one of the most important industries in the country. It provided lots of jobs, potential for economic growth, tax revenue. The brewery group that was in power had interest in all sectors of Namibian commerce and industry, in hotels, supermarkets, the meat industry, fishing industry, real estate, etc. So they basically made a deal in order to support each other. And the brewery actually co-wrote the new liquor legislation of the independent country. And in return, the new government protected SWAPO from breweries outside of Namibia. But there was, of course, still the problem of this company being very, very German, very white, very Southwest identity. So they changed their name to Namibia Breweries instead of Southwest Breweries. And they launched an elaborate marketing campaign, publishing in all sorts of magazines, explaining to the population that they were a truly Namibian company, and they had been for a long time. They donated different farms. They undertook development aid. They provided free beer for the president's birthday. So they went on a charm offensive to the population and the political regime. And if we look at this today, we can easily say that it worked, because Namibia Breweries is one of the cornerstones of Namibian nationalism, one of the, a pride of the Namibian nation in a way.
Can you go into a bit more, Tycho, on how Southwest Breweries changed its identity into its new name and new presence? Did it completely change its branding, its logo? Was there still some persistence in its former, more colonial identity, or did it really do a 180?
This is an interesting paradox, because it's actually both. So on the one hand, the branding is very much like Namibian, and it stresses, unity, solidarity, the indigenous roots of the brewing company. But if you look like behind the scenes, so to say, into the daily operations of the company, as I mentioned before, people are still speaking German. They're still using German Reinheitsgebot, and there's nothing wrong with that. And I love Windhoek Lager. I think it's a great beer, and the people that work there are extremely professional, extremely nice. But it's sort of it is an interesting contrast, between these two different messages, but they seem to go together. And I think that's a wonderful example of nationalism, of what we talked earlier, how versatile nationalism can be, and it can be molded and shaped into different forms. And the outcome in Namibia and in the Namibian beer industry is perhaps a very strange form if you look at it for the first time, but it works. And I visited the Oktoberfest myself in Windhoek. It was a sweltering heat. I was wearing my lederhosen. There was a band from Germany was playing. The beer was flowing freely from the taps, and everyone had a jolly good time. So, I mean, yeah.
I find that so fascinating. That's really, really cool. Do you have any pictures of that, Tycho? I'd like to see those.
Not in the book, no.
Yeah. All right. All right. So Southwest Breweries becomes Namibia Brewery or Namibia Breweries?
Breweries.
Namibia Breweries. Okay. So then into the 1990s and then into the 21st century, they obviously still have a big foundational presence in the country. You mentioned that's so interesting. They actually assisted in writing the liquor legislation in the country, which might be a conflict of interest, but that's interesting to hear. Now, if we look at more of a modern Namibia, do we see any more competition in the brewing industry, or Namibia breweries sort of still reign supreme?
There's a wonderful story in modern Namibia that reflects the tension that existed during the South African colonial period. When Namibia became independent in 1990, Namibia Breweries was still a very small company by any standards. But South African Breweries, which was obviously the main brewery in South Africa, was a giant, one of the largest brewing companies in the world. And it controlled basically 90% of the Southern African brewing market, uh, except Namibia. They were holding out. And the new Namibian government protected Namibia breweries from South African breweries for a long time because SAB wanted a brewing license to establish um, a brewery within Namibia. That was not allowed for a long time, and it gave Namibia breweries the time to sort of develop themselves into a very modern, state-of-the-art company. And then Namibia Breweries opened up a brewery in South Africa, right into the heartland of their main competitor, the main rival. And of course, there is also almost a political dimension to this in a way. And the funny thing is that Namibian beer became very popular in South Africa. People were loving it. And the sales in South Africa of Namibian beer became higher than the sales of Namibian beer in Namibia. So actually the export market in South Africa became a lifeline for Namibia breweries in order to remain independent and to remain in business. And we already discussed the beer war in the 1920s, in the 1910s in German Southwest Africa. But here we see another sort of beer war between Namibia breweries and South African breweries. And similar to the one that occurred 100 years ago, they were taking out ads in newspapers and magazines, and they were smearing each other and telling all sorts of stories and rumors and etc. And I actually think that this competition from South African breweries helped the Namibian population in accepting Namibia breweries as one of their own, so to say. And still, if you are in Namibia today, you're drinking a Windhoek lager, and you're not drinking a Castle beer or a Black Label, which is a South African beer. So there, obviously, this goes in lots of contexts around the world, but beer becomes very strongly aligned to political identities very quickly.
What about Tycho, the massive macro breweries that exist across the world? Coors, Anheuser-Busch, InBev, do they have any presence in Namibia, or does Namibia breweries, and I guess South African breweries, are those the popular brands, or can you find Heineken and even maybe Guinness or something like, are those present or not really at all?
Yeah, you can find some of those brands, also like Amstel, for example, and they are brewed according to licenses. So they don't have their own breweries in the country, but licensed, they're being being brewed and distributed across the nation. But the vast majority of drinkers drinks local Namibian beer, and it's a matter of pride. And even today, Namibia Breweries is able to hold on to this massive market share. And one interesting development that you find anywhere in the world is craft brewery, for example. So also in Namibia, some like small independent craft breweries emerged. But then at the moment they become successful, they're being bought by Namibia Breweries and they're being incorporated into their line of beers. So yeah, it's a very strong company. It's a very important company, not just in terms of production and consumption, but also in terms of image.
Yeah, that was my next question about craft breweries, obviously an institution that I'm quite interested in. So there are craft breweries, you mentioned that they typically, when they find some form of success, they get gobbled up. But if you were in Namibia today, you could find some smaller, independent, local microbreweries or craft breweries. Those do exist.
Yeah, they exist. Namibia Breweries also founded their own craft brewery in response to those developments, and it's actually quite interesting. This craft brewery is in Swakopmund, which is a coastal town, a popular holiday resort, also for Namibians. And those beers are brewed separately from like the main brewery. So there's much more freedom also in changing up the beers every once in a while. And yeah, I mean that's all lovely, of course, but it is definitely a minority, also in terms of consumption. It's not very regular that people drink craft beer.
Mm-hmm. So Namibia Breweries currently in 2022, almost 2023, there are how many breweries are under that umbrella? Are you aware of that, Tycho?
I find it difficult to answer because Namibia Breweries is the sort of the brand that is the main face of the company, and there are different smaller companies like Hansa Brewery or Camelthorn Brewery that were incorporated, and some of the beers that they produced are still available, but distinct from like the company name that existed prior to them being usurped by the big brother, so to say. So Namibia Breweries remains the most important name today and has been for the past 100 years.
Well, Tycho, this has been such an interesting and fascinating journey through a country's history that I'm pretty ignorant to. So this has been wonderful. I know we're coming up on our hour mark, so I, of course, want to be respectful of your time. But I do want to end with one final question. You've kind of weaved your way through a major portion of this country's recent history, kind of analyzing the entire portion of the 20th century and a little bit before and a little bit after. So can you talk a little bit about the current state of beer in Namibia, as well as touch on where you think trends are going, maybe in the next 10 years or so? Do you see Namibia Breweries continuing to have its strong presence and basic dominance across the country? Is that something that's not going away and that really has kind of dug itself into the national fabric of this country? Or do you see some change occurring? Do you see that maybe craft breweries, the big craft brewery trends might shake things up a little bit more? Maybe larger players are coming into the marketplace. What do you see happening in the 21st century?
Well, as a historian, you're asking me an impossible question because I'm basically forbidden to look into the future on account of my education and training. But yeah, if I would try, I definitely think that Namibia Breweries is a strong brand that will continue to exist for a long time. But innovation within the Namibian brewing market is difficult simply because it's such a small market. So there's not much space, so to say, to try very adventurous things. I do think there is growth possible in terms of export. I think, for example, that Windhoek Lager, which is the main export brand and refers to the capital city of Windhoek in Namibia, will find its way to Europe. For example, there's some small importers in Germany and in the UK that buy Windhoek Lager, but I wouldn't be surprised if it can become popular in other countries as well. Um, yeah, that's basically how I would see the foreseeable future.
I like that. I know it's never a fair game to play asking a historian about the future, but I thought I'd try anyways. How far along are you in your PhD?
Well, I'm in my final year at the moment, but it deals with an entirely different topic, namely the study of North Korea and North Korean relations with African states. But the funny thing is that this project that I'm doing at the moment found also its roots in the beer history. Because when I was traveling back and forth between the Netherlands and Namibia, I encountered some North Korean monuments in Windhoek, and I registered them as being very strange, and I didn't understand them. But I realized that this also would be an interesting story to investigate. And I always remembered that while I was doing my studies for the beer history, and then I picked it up again when I was finished. So yeah, there's again a link with this project.
Mm-hmm. That's fascinating. I'd love to speak more about that later with you, maybe. Absolutely. Do you think Tycho are more projects on beer in your future? You think, is that a topic that particularly fascinates you, or it's more the issues of all different shapes and sizes with the continent?
Well, I think the beer story for me personally is over because I'm now moving on to different fields. But if you ever want to chat about beer in North Korea, perhaps we can make a new episode about it because it's also quite an interesting story in itself.
I will definitely take you up on that. That's really cool. All right, Tycho van der Hoog, thank you very much for your time. A great book, Breweries, Politics, and Identity, The History Behind Namibia's Beer. Definitely a fascinating read, and I really learned a lot. Tycho, thank you so much. Good luck with the rest of your studies, and look forward to chatting with you again soon.
Thank you.
Be sure to subscribe to stay up to date on all our interviews and beer-related content. Remember, craft beer is here.